Hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in to another one of my videos. This video will be based on the final project that I've done for Linguistics 501 Research Methods and Bibliography, offered at California State University, Fullerton, under the direction of Dr. Operstein. I'm quite interested actually in sharing with you this video. I found the topic to be extremely interesting. Ever since I was young, I was always interested really in the way that languages can interact with one another, and really just kind of analyzing different languages and seeing what similarities they have and what differences they have, and just really the idea of bringing languages together really interests me. So that's why I've decided to do a project on lexical borrowing. So I've called this study Lexical Borrowing when deux languages entrent en collision. Basically, I just wanted to meld both languages together, really just to show how languages can enter in contact with one another, and this is kind of the outcome, a potential outcome that can be seen. And basically later on I'll explain really why I decided to go this route for the title, as I look at some different types of lexical borrowings that can occur. So I'm just going to provide a brief presentation overview right now. So I'm just going to provide a brief introduction, going to get into some definitions, going to get into some pertinent terms, and then also cognate aspect of lexical borrowing, and then we're going to look at it as a basis of forming new words. And we're going to look a little bit at the morphology and phonology behind it, and then some issues surrounding it, and then finishing off with the conclusion, of course, my contact, and then references. So just looking a little bit at the introduction, this field of study has existed for well over a century. So Haugen 1950 actually explains that the first documented case of lexical borrowing happened in 1886, and before that there's actually influence on languages way before that. When dealing with Middle English actually was influenced by Old French, so really this contact of languages has existed way back in the history of language. And so basically lexical borrowing can focus on the morphology as well as phonology and even lexicology. And there are even studies that have been done on lexical statistics. So a really interesting one was done by Gachinsky, and it is just dealing with lexical borrowings and dealing with a little bit of stats, and really there was a complex formula that was used really that dealt with different constants. So it was quite interesting really to see how this field of study can go from just general linguistics to actually hardcore statistics. So it's quite interesting that could go in so in depth with really dealing with the different stats and constants and variables that are involved. It's quite interesting. And so lexical borrowing is not limited only to spoken speech. So Bishop and Peterson 2011 discussed the importance of lexical borrowing in advertisements. So they did a study dealing with some American Mexicans and looking at different ads and seeing some English that was thrown into Spanish ads, and as well as some Spanish words that were thrown into some English ads, and just really seeing how these people were dealing with it, what they thought about it, if they kept their interest in it, if they were more intrigued because they saw these different words from different languages in it. So Haugen 1950 also comments on the fact that lexical borrowing can occur without the speaker's consent or even awareness. And then some linguists kind of use the terms code switching and lexical borrowing interchangeably. They mean almost the same thing. They're very similar, but they're not quite identical. So now I'm just going to move into a definition of lexical borrowing. So Nelson, Sathi et al. 2010 explained that lexical borrowing is a transfer of a word from a donor language to a recipient language as a result of a certain kind of contact between the speakers of two languages. And Rothwell 1972 explains that borrowing results when there is a deficiency in the native vocabulary that is also coupled with a temporary cultural superiority in a number of various fields with the donor language. So I'm just going to give an example that I thought is quite interesting. It's kind of dealing with a little bit of lack of language contact, but it's interesting to see that there is a word that doesn't exist in English but exists in Portuguese, and this word is saudade. But there's a verb that exists in English that kind of has a deficiency in Portuguese, but yet these terms are somewhat related. So the verb to miss in English doesn't really have a translation in Portuguese. So basically, saudade can roughly be translated as missness in English. So it's really the idea behind missing something, almost as if you're yearning or you're longing for something, just the idea that you don't have it, you miss it. It's not quite nostalgia. It's kind of all mixed together. It's quite an emotional state. And so this word does not exist in English. However, the verb to miss, if I want to say I miss you, in Portuguese there's no equivalent for that. I would have to use estou com saudades de você. So roughly translates to be. So estou com saudades de você is I am with missness of you. So it's kind of the idea of I am possessing the missness of you. I miss you. So I thought that was interesting to see how there's a lexical gap in one language, and then kind of there's also a lexical gap in the other language. So they're somewhat related, but yet both languages have a lexical gap with them. Okay, so just moving on to some content aspects of borrowing. So there are a lot of positive outcomes of being multilingual. However, there are a few negative aspects. So one negative aspect that's quite interesting actually was a study that was done in 2010 that explains that vocabulary knowledge have consistently reported lower scores for bilinguals in each language than for monolingual speakers of that language, and this deficit appears at all ages across the lifespan. So it's interesting, you may be able to say a word in a few different languages, but when you're looking at the whole number of words that you know in your own particular language, it might be actually lower than a monolingual speaker, which is quite interesting. So just a little bit of terminology concerning lexical borrowing. So a good explanation of the types of borrowing is provided by Haugen, 1950. It's an excellent article, probably one of the pioneering articles really in the field of study. It includes tons of different terms that can be associated with lexical borrowing and examples. It's a very interesting article. So Haugen refers to the original pattern as the model, and how the law may be similar in many ways to the model, but it may also express some differences. So another study by Chesley and Bayan 2010 explained important definitions to be aware of. So one definition that is rather important is a recipient language, which is kind of what you might be thinking is a language into which the borrowing enters, and then the donor language, of course, is like a donor. It's the language of source of origin, so it's the language that's giving. So Haugen, 1950, on pages 213 and 214, he includes 4 different types of borrowing. So a loan word. He explains that the loan word is really the vaguest word that you can use. It kind of includes everything. Hybrid is kind of when you use one element that is found in both languages, but every single component to the word is not transferred within all languages. So one example was dealing with plum pie in English. You'd say plum pie, so you have pie with it, but when we're looking at Pennsylvania German, the first part of the word actually was different, but they kept the pie, so it was a hybrid that way. A loan translation is also known as a calque in French. It's a word-for-word translation, and generally these are not acceptable. And it's just bringing back to the title really when I was saying when deux languages entrent en collision. Basically I was just kind of translating word for word the French translation for to collide. So French doesn't really have just one verb for to collide. It really has entrer en collision, which means to enter in a collision. So that's basically, I was just using both languages and I was just bringing them together almost as if it was a loan translation, incorporating some elements of French and some elements of English together. Also, there are semantic loans, and that's basically just when the words appear to be identical, but however they have different meanings, where one meaning from one language actually gets transferred over to another one. Haugen, however, does provide examples where word-for-word translations are acceptable, and one case was dealing with skyscraper, which can be translated in many Romance languages with kind of a translation of both elements that are in there, sky and then scrape. So in French we can get gratte-ciel, and then in Spanish we can get rascacielos. So basically ciel or cielo can translate to sky, and then gratter and rascar can be translated to like to scratch. And this also can be translated into German with Wolkenkratzer. So Haugen 1950 also includes other types of borrowing, include loan words, loan blends, loan shifts, and loan word phonology. And then DeWill 1998 adds false friends to the list, where a word from a donor language is received in the recipient language with similar phonological and morphological patterns, but the semantics are radically different. So one example can be when we're looking at English, we have the word actually, and if we look at French or Spanish, we can get actuellement, which you would think is actually, because when we get ly, usually it translates into Romance languages with ment or mente. But in this case, actualmente or actuellement means nowadays. So the form of the word is quite similar, but the meaning is completely different. And then Gardner-Kloros 1983 also provides some differentiations in terms of code switching. So there's situational code switching, conversational code switching, and metaphorical code switching. And so she explains that situational code switching really just deals with activities. Conversational is dealing with the conversation, so really there might be elements of another language that are just brought right into the middle of the sentence. And this also can actually imply metaphorical code switching, so maybe the speaker does it just for a metaphor. So looking now at lexical borrowings as a basis to forming new words, so Chesley and Bai in 2010 discussed an important issue in regards to lexical borrowing and how languages of prestige are more apt to produce lexical entrenchment rather than less prestigious languages. Ben Raphael 2008 discusses how English is a lingua franca and English has a strong influence on many languages, and Brown 1996 explains that lingua francas have a strong influence on vocabularies of other languages, which is definitely the case. There's a lot of loan words in other languages that are from English. And then Nelson Safi and et al. 2010 explained that Old Norse and Old French were huge influences on the English language, and approximately 8% of all words in English are borrowed from those languages. It's quite interesting. Okay, so moving on now, just dealing with morphology of lexical borrowing. So one main issue is really dealing with gender. So in English there's three genders. There's masculine, there's feminine, and then there's neuter. Whereas other languages like French only have masculine or feminine. So it's kind of easy when we're dealing with man or woman. If we were to use these and they were going to be brought into the French language as a lexical borrowing, most likely they're going to keep their natural gender. So we would say le man, la woman. But when we deal with gym, which is a neuter noun, what are we going to do? What are we going to say? Are we going to say le gym? Or are we going to say la gym? So it's interesting how when languages are brought into different languages, gender must be incorporated into this, because you just can't invent a gender for a language that doesn't have that gender. I just can't bring neuter gender into the French language. That doesn't exist. And even depending on where the language is spoken, actually the gender of the word might change. So in Quebec, French, gym is actually masculine, whereas in France, gym is actually feminine. So it's interesting. So you could say je vais à la gym if you are in France, or je vais au gym for I go to the gym if you're in Quebec. So Haddon and Juliet 1940 explained that English words that end in ER generally are pronounced in French as heure, which would correlate best to EUR and can be changed to feminine by EUSE. And other endings include AGE and ING. And now some nouns ending in ING are masculine, with smoking, which is a tuxedo jacket, but there are some exceptions where we get une crossing for a crossing. And Guilford 1999 explains that nouns can be assigned gender based on analogies, whether they are semantic, morphological, or phonetic. However, he's not able to rely solely on these analogies, as Guilford 1999 comments that within the same semantic family, some nouns bear different genders. Number actually is quite interesting really to look at. So when words are brought into another language, when they're borrowed, are they borrowed as a singular noun or are they borrowed as a plural noun? So I'm just going to provide the example of spaghetti. So in Italian, nouns ending in O are masculine and singular, and the nouns ending in I actually are plural and masculine. So we have spaghetti, which is kind of singular in English, but the form spaghetti is actually plural in Italian. But in English, we can add spaghettis to make it plural. So we're going to add the regular English plural marker, which is an S. And in English, we can't say a spaghetto. I'm not going to say I'm eating a spaghetto. I'm going to say I'm eating spaghetti. So you're going to use a plural Italian noun as a singular noun in English, or I'm eating spaghettis. But we don't generally say spaghettis, but it is possible. So you can't say these spaghetti. It's kind of these spaghettis. And then another example is dealing with French. So we can have le caméraman, and then we get les caméramans. So we get actually an S that's added to man, whereas in English, man is singular and men with an E is plural. But in French, they don't say les caméramens, they say les caméramans with an S on it. So in French, it opts to prefer to use the French pluralization rather than the English pluralization. So now looking at a little bit of phonology of lexical borrowing, Rettman, 1978, provided a detailed overview of the phonetic adaptations that occurred with the loanwords from English and the French language, detailing the realization of each phoneme and whether or not the non-native speakers were able to produce the correct phoneme. So an example that I just made myself is dealing with Kraft dinner, or Kraft mac and cheese for the US. So in English we'll say Kraft dinner, in Canadian English, Manitoban English. And then in French, you'd actually say, mainly Quebec French, you would say Kraft diner. So kind of, it's quite different from Kraft dinner, Kraft diner. And then when dealing with Lindqvist in 2010 explains that research has proved that the learner focuses more on the formal as well as phonological aspects of the word in the early process of acquiring the language, then the focus is shifted towards semantics at later stages of acquisition. And Wiley, 1998, continues to provide examples when borrowing has some shortcomings, where either the pronunciation is not native-like or the form of the word is not. So an example can be fiancé. In English you'll say fiancé, and then in French it's fiancé. And also when dealing with the word, a lot of people in English might not add the extra E, whereas in French the extra E implies that it's feminine. And the form of the word might be French, but the pronunciation might be English. So an example could be un chèque for a check. So in English it's check, and then in French it should be chèque. But you might hear someone pronounce un chèque, which would be the English pronunciation, so it's not quite right. They borrowed the English pronunciation for the French word. So just some issues concerning lexical borrowing. Rothwell, 1972, on page 287, explains a little bit on how French feels about the influence of English and how French officials had invoked legal sanctions in an attempt to dam the flood of Anglo-Saxon terms introduced into French, while scholars of distinction have poured out all of their eloquence in the service of what they see as preservation of the purity of French. And Scott in 1982 provides a very interesting reason behind the use of English in parts of Africa, and just explaining that the study that was done was mainly focusing on Kenya, but they were just explaining how in Kenya when someone uses English it's kind of a sign of authority, and it's done by choice. And then Manny 1994 discusses the different feelings that Quebec and France have with respect to lexical borrowing. So Quebec does not like anglicisms, meaning words that are really English in nature. And in Quebec French, these can be signs that are rather menacing and are present in the language, whereas France has a completely different view and sees these words as a sign of the modern era. And then Guilford, 1997, explains that French people show an increased level of knowledge about English loanwords than with the recommended French equivalents. And then Haddon and Joliet, 1940, explain that French Canadians find the use of English as a linguistic sin. So in conclusion, studies on lexical borrowing have existed for over a century, and studies will continue in the future. Many linguists have taken different approaches, as I have mentioned throughout the course of this presentation. We can focus on the phonology, we can focus on the morphology, we can focus really on formation of words, we can even focus on stats if you want to really get mathematical in nature. And but all of them show evidence that there is language context, so there's always language context when dealing with lexical borrowing or code switching. Some people use lexical borrowing for various reasons. So some use it for a sign of authority, as in Kenya, others because of a way of expressing their connection with the rest of the world, and even the outcomes of lexical borrowing vary across the speakers. Some people are able to produce these borrowings with really native-like competencies, and others struggle with it and kind of retain a lot of features from their native tongue. And lexical borrowing is an interesting subject that merits further studies. So that just concludes my presentation. I hope everyone enjoys. So here is my contact information. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to send me an email or make a question in the comment section below, and I'd be happy to try to answer it. And as well, if you enjoy my presentations, please like it and subscribe to my channel. I would be very appreciative. And these are the references in case you want to check out any of the articles that you think might be interesting. So thank you once again very much for watching. Goodbye.